It begins with a whisper, a story that was never meant to be told, a story carried in fragments of letters, medical notes, and the hushed words of townspeople who swore they saw something impossible. In an age when love was bound by distance, tradition, and the rigid grip of society, two lives crossed without touch, without even a shared gaze. And yet, from their separation, a child was born. Everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon before this story pulls you in too deep. What you are about to hear is not a tale of romance. It is a tangle of science, secrecy, and the haunting idea that intimacy is not always born of closeness. Some say it was an experiment gone wrong. Others claim it was a curse whispered down through bloodlines, where the rules of nature were bent until they snapped. The documents left behind do not agree. Some speak of a scientist working in shadows, using two unwilling donors. Others tell of a family whose shame ran so deep they constructed a story hiding the truth behind the phrase. They had a baby without ever meeting. Whatever the origin, one fact remains undeniable. Somewhere, behind barred doors and forgotten archives, a child was brought into this world through means the public was never meant to know. Picture the late 19th century, a time of crude laboratories tucked inside decaying basements, glass jars filled with pale liquids, and the scent of iodine drifting in the air. To most, medicine was about survival. To a few, it was about control. Control of life, control of bloodlines, control of birth itself. And that is where this story begins, with two strangers, never crossing paths, never holding hands, never even hearing the other's voice, and yet joined together by something darker than fate. Their union was orchestrated, hidden, and recorded in shaky handwriting that feels more like confession than fact. The baby was real. The parents, they were ghosts to each other. Now, ask yourself, how could such a thing happen in a world bound by rules and morality? And more chilling, why was it buried so carefully that even now, more than a century later, the details leak only in fragments? The official records are contradictory, but they all share one thread. Secrecy, somewhere in America, in a town whose name surfaces only in fragmented letters. Whispers spread of a baby born into silence. There was no wedding, no witnesses, no home that welcomed the child with open doors. Instead, there were locked rooms, guarded ledgers, and the constant feeling that someone, somewhere, had broken a law far greater than any written by men. The town at first dismissed it as rumor. After all, how could two people who never met, never breathed the same air, become parents? But old records from physicians tell a different story. Notes scrawled in the margins of medical journals describe experiments with donated material. Words left vague and hauntingly clinical. A child produced not from love, not from choice, but from an arrangement that blurred the lines between progress and blasphemy. Some historians now argue that this may have been one of the first hidden attempts at artificial conception, decades before such things were even whispered in public. Others believe it was never about science at all, that it was a cover-up for something darker, something the families could not admit. Brother and sister, cousins, bloodlines so twisted that the only way to explain the child's birth was to invent a tale of strangers who never met. But why does the story persist, generation after generation? Perhaps because the child grew. Photographs, nearly destroyed but salvaged from dust and decay, show a face too unsettling to ignore. The features appear off. One eye slightly higher than the other, lips pursed in a crooked line, skin pale as if the child had been carved from candle wax rather than born. These details are never spoken aloud in family records, but those who studied the photographs describe unease, a sense that something had gone wrong in the process of creation. Imagine being told you were born not from love, not from chance, but from design. Imagine carrying that knowledge into adulthood, your very existence, the product of shadows. The town knew, but it pretended not to. The doctors knew, but they wrote in riddles. And the family? They locked the truth away, as if the walls of their house could contain it. Yet, the story refuses to die, because every child leaves a trace. By the 1930s, the whispers had grown louder. Teachers in the town school recalled a child who did not fit, though none would admit it directly. Descriptions vary. Some said the boy's eyes were too bright, unblinking for far too long. Others said he spoke with an unsettling calm, far beyond his years. One teacher, whose diary surfaced nearly a century later, wrote a line that still sends chills down the spine. He does not seem like the others. It is as if he remembers things he should not know. And yet, the official story remained unchanged. Two strangers, they said. A baby born without touch, without meeting, without love. But if that were true, how did the child inherit mannerisms so strikingly similar to one of the most prominent families in the region? Even the way he walked, the slight tilt of his head, mirrored a man who swore he had never fathered him. The local church became uneasy. Sermons turned fiery, condemning what they called the creation of life outside divine order. Families whispered that the child was cursed, the living embodiment of arrogance against God. Still, no one dared confront the truth directly, for if the child was not the result of science, then he was something worse, the product of bloodlines too close to bear repeating. But this is where the story takes its most chilling turn. At just 12 years old, the boy vanished from town records. No explanation, no obituary, just gone. Some say he was sent away to distant relatives who would not question his origins. Others claim something darker, that the town itself conspired to erase him, to bury a mistake that should never have drawn breath. Years later, fragments of letters written by a midwife were discovered in an attic, their edges brittle with age. In them she describes not just the boy, but another child, a twin, hidden, forgotten. The words are frantic, as though she feared for years, our life. Even writing them, two were born, one was shown, the other was taken. If true, then the mystery deepens. Were both children products of the same unholy arrangement? Were they hidden to protect reputations, or because they carried something too disturbing to face? And why has every attempt to track their lineage led to dead ends, burned archives, or sealed family vaults? History does not like gaps, but here the silence speaks louder than words. The discovery of those letters should have been the end of the mystery. A forgotten midwife, a record of twins, a whisper of a secret buried in dust. But instead, it raised questions no one was ready to answer. Why were there no baptism records? Why did every census report skip over the year the children were born? And why, when historians tried to revisit the archives, did they find entire pages torn clean out of church registers, Whole families erased, as though by design. In the town's folklore, a strange phrase begins to appear after the year of the twins' birth. The elders spoke of children without touch. At first, it sounded like more metaphor, but those words persisted, passed down in hushed tones. Some believed it meant they were children made in isolation without meeting of flesh. Others claimed it was darker, that their very existence came from kinship bonds that should never have been crossed, the kind no one would admit aloud. A man named Walter Hensley, an amateur historian, claimed in a 1952 interview that he once found a family Bible in a farmhouse cellar. Inside, the entries began as expected: births, deaths, marriages, all carefully recorded. But then came a line written in an unsteady hand: two born of one, though never met. Just as quickly as the phrase appeared, the Bible was confiscated by relatives and locked away. Walter insisted he was threatened afterward, told never to speak of it again. He did once, and only once. After that, he vanished from public life. The suggestion of a hidden twin took on a life of its own. In some versions, the second child was said to have been malformed, a reflection of the unnatural bond that created them. Others insist that the second child lived in secret, raised in shadow, their existence hidden but their presence undeniable, appearing at the edges of photographs, seen in crowds where they should not have been. And then came the journals of a doctor, unearthed only decades later, pages stained and nearly illegible. He wrote of being called to a farmhouse one stormy night. There, he claimed, he saw both children. His words: they looked at me together, as though mirrored, one smiling, one not. But their eyes were the same. He left the town shortly after. His notes end abruptly. This is not history as we know it. It is history that hides, the kind we are not supposed to look too closely at. But if even half of these fragments are true, then the mystery was never about one child at all. It was about two. By the middle of the 20th century, the story of the child born from strangers who never met had begun to rot into something darker than rumor. To the outside world, the town looked ordinary: dusty streets, peeling paint, children laughing in the yards. But beneath that surface lived a silence that weighed heavier than stone. Families passed down the truth only in fragments, whispered warnings to younger generations. Never speak of where you came from. Never ask who you truly are. Old census records showed strange gaps, names crossed out, years misaligned, children appearing without recorded parents. It was as if the town's genealogy had been rewritten by a hand that trembled with shame. Anyone who tried to dig deeper, be it a curious traveler, a historian, or even a nosy neighbor, was met with unease. The locals didn't argue. They didn't deny. They simply looked at you too long, with eyes that said, "You've already gone too far." Diaries that survived from the period painted a chilling portrait. One described a young girl being told that her father lived in the same county, but she would never be allowed to see him. Another entry spoke of a boy who would sit by the creek for hours, staring into the water, repeating that his blood belonged to two shadows that never touched. These weren't ordinary confessions. They were fragments of lives shaped by an unnatural beginning. The silence grew into a kind of sickness. Families carried the weight of being bound to a story they didn't choose. They learned to smile in public, but behind closed doors, their reflections seemed to haunt them. They weren't just hiding a truth, they were living proof of it. And perhaps the most unsettling part was this: the town never tried to bury the past with denial. They buried it by pretending it had always been normal. The child who should never have existed had become more than a person. She became a ghost etched into the bloodline of everyone who followed. By the late century, whispers of the story began to leak outside the borders of the town. Researchers stumbled on fragments, archived letters, mismatched birth records, family Bibles, where whole branches of the tree had been carefully erased. What they found didn't just suggest secrecy, it screamed it. And yet, no one ever spoke in detail. It was as if an invisible hand always silenced the final word. Some believed the child, grown into adulthood, lived quietly and carried her lineage forward. Others insisted she never aged, or that she became more myth than woman, appearing in old photographs where her face seemed familiar, yet wrong. There were stories of her descendants marrying into other families, the truth diluted but never gone. Even if the child herself had long since passed, the legacy she left behind lingered in every uneasy glance exchanged between the older townsfolk. Researchers described something unnerving in the way locals spoke, or refused to speak. They avoided certain family names, certain houses, certain grave markers. One journalist wrote of being invited to dinner by a family who smiled politely, but never once used the word father. It was as though the idea itself had been banned from their vocabulary. And so the question became larger, darker. If a life begins from a union without meeting, without touch, without love, what does that do to the soul? What does it do to the generations who carry that weight? Was the child merely human, or a reminder that even nature can be bent into shapes it was never meant to take? This was not just a personal story anymore. It had become an echo of humanity's darkest tendency, to control what cannot be controlled, to force what should never be forced. And the echoes of that choice could still be felt, like a sickness passed quietly through the bloodline of the town. The last fragments of this story exist not in archives or libraries, but in whispers, passed from one reluctant tongue to another. And when you follow those whispers long enough, you find yourself staring into a silence thicker than words, a silence people are desperate to protect. The child who should not have been born became less a person and more a symbol, haunting every generation that followed. Some say her bloodline never ended, that her descendants walk among us, carrying traits no one dares to acknowledge out loud. An unusual resemblance here, an uncanny birthmark there. Things shrugged off, never spoken of again. Others believe the family erased itself on purpose, retreating deeper into secrecy until their names, their graves, and even their houses disappeared into the soil. But the town remembers, the land remembers. The air seems heavier in the places where they lived, as if the ground itself holds the memory of what happened. Visitors describe an unshakable feeling, like eyes watching from behind curtains, or voices murmuring just beneath the threshold of hearing. And in those places, people claim time feels different, as if the past still walks alongside the present, refusing to let go. It is tempting to treat this story as legend, to dismiss it as folklore meant to frighten children. Yet the documents exist. The letters are real. The inconsistencies in the birth records are undeniable. Too much smoke clings to this story for there not to be fire, and that is the most unsettling truth of all. The child of a forbidden union may have been very real, and if so, her blood may still be flowing quietly in veins today. Because stories like this are not just about the past. They are warnings. They are reminders that some choices leave scars so deep, entire communities are built on pretending they never happened. But silence cannot erase history. It only makes it more dangerous when it finally comes to light. Every story leaves a scar. Drop yours in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Something is always listening.